Welcome to this most recent episode of the Akkad and Coca report. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Josh Gottlieb on. Dr. Gottlieb is an associate professor at the University of Chicago. He is, this is at the Harris School of Public Policy. He is first author of a paper that has generated a lot of buzz among doctors. The title of the paper is "Who Values Human Capitalists' Human Capital? Healthcare Spending and Physician Earnings." And this paper goes into and discusses what physicians earn, and specifically tries to look at what the role of government is in what physicians earn, which has some pretty interesting implications. So thanks, welcome for coming on, Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks so much for having me. And you should know that in economics, authorship is alphabetical. So I am first author, not by dint of my unique contribution, but by dint of my unique last name.
Can we get another guest? Yeah, we thought we were getting the first author.
What's going on?
You got the most random author.
No wonder it was so easy to get you. No, I'm kidding. But really, thank you for coming on. Your time is super important. It's 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I'm sure you could be doing many better things than whiling away time with these two cardiologists, certainly. You start your paper off with some pretty interesting quotes. You actually quote another favorite of doctors, Case and Deaton. It says, "The healthcare industry is not very good at promoting health, but excels at promoting wealth among healthcare providers, including some successful private physicians who operate extremely profitable practices." Crawford, there's another quote from Crawford. I'm not as familiar with that individual. That says, "My hand surgeon should have been paid $4.5 billion for fixing my broken wrist, not $1,000. So competing quotes, perhaps. But tell me, Josh, or Dr. Gottlieb, tell me what the major impetus was for you doing this study.
Well, it really is that there are a lot of strong opinions about the topic and no facts. And we wanted to get some facts out there. It's just, people have long been interested in physicians' earnings, and I think with good reason. We can talk about what those reasons are, that it's especially interesting. But the income is hard to measure. As you and your listeners probably know, it comes through a variety of different sources and types of payments, and surveys have a lot of problems, especially at the top of the income distribution, which, as we find, is where a lot of doctors are. And so perhaps not surprising that we haven't been able to get a lot of good measures until now, and we have the advantage of being able to use tax data. So to the extent people are honest on their taxes, we have better measures than the past.
So we're gonna get into some of those details about how you came up with some of the data that you have. But why is it so interesting to economists what doctors make? Is there some amount of envy, perhaps?
I mean, I suppose there's always some envy when you start thinking about the top income discussion. But my motivation is that the government is so intertwined in all of this. And we're having a lot of discussions in society these days about high incomes, about government policies towards high incomes. And there is probably no occupation other than, I guess, government employees themselves, whose earnings are so tied up in what the government does, how much the government decides to pay and decides to value the services. So that's why I think it's especially unique. A lot of other things that are interesting about it, but are not necessarily unique to physicians, like that there's a long time to train and people work hard and very specialized skills. Lots of occupations have those features. This occupation also has just obvious public policy importance.
But with the idea that if you discover that, you don't need a study to suggest that physicians are, just looking around and seeing where physicians live and whatnot, it seems reasonably obvious that physicians make, a reasonable amount of money relative to other folks in society. Would you agree by saying that these type of studies are geared towards kind of showing that and quantifying that to the wider public with the idea of doing what? Like, what would you, because you're kind of laying out these steps to say, okay, physicians are high income earners. government is a significant source of that. And so what's that, what's that next thing that you're not quite saying perhaps?
Sure. Well, so the meat of what we do is actually measuring exactly how and when and why the government influences these incomes. So there are a lot of steps between CMS deciding on a payment rate and the money ending up in your bank account or on your tax return, right? You have a practice or you work for a hospital and you've got to treat somebody and the patient has a reimbursement rate that may be determined by CMS or may come from a private contract with an insurance company that you've signed, which could reflect the CMS rates in a variety of ways. And then you have expenses that come out of that. And then you might share that money with partners or with other staff, or you might have to pay for more supplies to treat those extra patients. And so I think it's not at all obvious ex ante whether that in fact ends up in the doctor's pockets. And in fact, we find that there's a lot of variation in how much it does. It depends on how the practice is organized and what sort of employment arrangements the physician has. And so that the paper is quantifying that. Yeah.
Right. So what do you, once you quantify it, what's your purpose? Your intent is to say that, well, then, given that government is a significant source of income for doctors, does that automatically imply, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like that automatically implies, well, hey, maybe government should not be necessarily doing this. Would that be a fair?
Well, no, I don't think that would be fair. I think I'm going to take you back to those two quotes that you started with. Some people think that this is outrageously high.
Okay.
Others think that the value that doctors add is extraordinarily high. And so I don't think the fact that the government can influence incomes tells us what those incomes should be.
But so you see yourself as kind of giving information out to the wider world to kind of make a decision then about how much government should influence it or what government should be doing.
Yeah,
right?
I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
So let's get to some of the meat of your paper. First of all, I'd love to talk about how exactly you came at it. No, a big problem. Again, it's not that there's never been a assessment done of what ends up in physician pockets in terms of what the total healthcare spend is, right? Even before this, there's a variety of different papers. I guess a lot of them sourced by survey data that have suggested that physician income is about 7%, 8%, et cetera, of this. But you certainly took a different approach than the survey approach. You tried to be, I guess, more empiric, and you used tax data. And somewhat disturbingly, you were able to take large databases. I guess the database that CMS uses, which has an NPI number, which is a unique number for every single physician in the United States. And that number, of course, that unique identifier carries with it a lot of information in terms of specialty and primary care, what type of specialty, et cetera. You took that database and then you combined it somehow with the tax database. So basically 1040s that all of us in some way or the other are filing, correct? Mm-hmm. And you were able to somehow link together who were the physicians in the 1040 database that you have and get at what the income being reported was. Am I getting that right?
You're getting that right.
I'm curious, what was the thing that allowed you to link NPI numbers to 1040s? Because as far as I know, and again, a lot of us have accountants mostly, but do I put my NPI number down on my 1040?
No. So the Census Bureau has a very widely used infrastructure for linking a variety of different data sets together. And this has been used in all sorts of papers, linking all sorts of different things. I should stress for everyone listening or watching that this is all done very carefully and confidentially. So we don't get your name. I could not go look you up by your name or by your NPI. I wouldn't want to, and I also wouldn't be allowed to. The penalties for going and saying, what's Dr. Coca's income? It's serious stuff, and the Census Bureau is very careful about it. So that should hopefully assuage any implicit concerns in your question. But people who have responded to surveys provide a lot of information. And look, when you file your taxes, the amount of information you give the government is pretty extraordinary, whether it's you or your accountant. And so the government needs that information. They have that information, and we're using it for research, certainly not for going after or looking up any individuals. And so this is linked in with basic biographical information, the same way lots and lots of other data sets are linked together on secure Census Bureau servers.
Okay. So
no, I mean, just to be clear, for example, is it that the Medicare database will have, in addition to the NPI, will have like somebody's address or something like that, so that, you know, some kind of information so you can link it to the tax database info? I mean, how would you? So it'd be a specific record in that database that allows you to link it to a specific record in that database.
Exactly. So people have linked school records, for example, to tax records with the parent's name, and my co-authors who work at the Census Bureau have done the heavy lifting on this, and I have to defer to them on the details of exactly how this is done. But there's also some references in the paper to some of the underlying infrastructure where this is all documented.
Okay. All right.
It's not unique to this setting or to this occupation.
So you so you were able to get these, you know, adjusted gross incomes that we all report on our 1040s, and you got that the 2017 average adjusted gross income among physician tax units was 422,600 average physician. Earnings of 343,600, median of $255,000. And so, you know, so those are some of the numbers that you arrived at. Now, the issue, of course, is that when you report stuff on your W-2, you're reporting your income from a variety of different sources, correct? So, yeah. So it's entirely possible that, again, physicians, one of the knocks on physicians, not knocks, but whatever, however you want to say it, is that, you know, we a lot of our parents are physicians. We come from wealth, and so it's certainly possible that the income that's being reported on those 1040s isn't necessarily just the return from physician earnings, right? Because you're getting all income that is coming in. So if you're a trust fund baby that had, you know, whatever, $250,000 of trust fund income a year, that would be included in that. And you have no great way of necessarily distinguishing that from the other, well, one from the other, correct?
It's not great, but it's better than you've implied. So okay. The AGI on the, as you say, the AGI on the 1040 includes all sorts of things and excludes some other things. So I guess the first thing I should emphasize is that it excludes any deductible expenses.
Right.
Right. So any expenses that you pay as a sole proprietorship or inside of a corporation would not be included. So people should not think that we're talking about gross revenue here.
Right. Right.
It includes W-2 income. You could get W-2s potentially from multiple different employers depending on where you work. It also includes business income, and it also includes financial income.
Right.
And so you're right that it's I don't think there's any perfect way of figuring out is that financial income that comes from your medical practice,
right,
or from investments that you made with last year's earnings from your medical practice,
right,
or an inheritance or something like that.
Right, right. And also
we do some work to try to tease those apart. But I'll let you jump in.
Right. So and again, the way W-2 income works is that physicians that own practices, you can set your W-2 income to be whatever you want, right? And then the other income can be realized in, you can take it in however you want as a pass-through or whatnot.
Depending on your legal structure.
Right, exactly. So again,
and that's part of why we want to be comprehensive, because imagine you own a corporation or a share in a corporation, and you keep the money in that corporation, and then at some point you retire and sell it.
Right.
That sale is part of your income, or any consulting income that you get. That's all part of your income, and so we want to include that. I think it's appropriate to include that, even if it's not realized until
But if the goal is to look at, and I know what you guys did in terms of a mechanism to try to figure out the government's portion. That's the next hurdle to kind of climb, right? One is figuring out what it is physicians are making, and you kind of get this 1040 dump of, okay, they're making this much. Then you have to figure out, all right, how much of it is from the practice versus not from the practice. There's no awesome way of doing that, because you certainly could have a significant amount of income from inheritance, for instance. That isn't, you could make a lot of income from consulting with pharmaceutical companies. You can make a lot of income being a medical director of, say, some IV infusion company. And again, the argument from economists would be, well, that's return of your medical practice. I mean, other than the inheritance stuff wouldn't be, but
yeah, wouldn't you agree with that? Wouldn't you agree? Aside from a medical director or pharmaceutical.
I would agree, except for that next part, right? The next part is, if you're you're a medical director of a company that does not take any revenue from the government, correct? This is some IV infusion company that whatever is paying is an all cash business, for instance, right? Then and you're making $200,000 a year from that. You have no way of parsing from this data set that of that $400,000 that's coming in total, that 200,000 is coming from an all cash business. We'll talk about how you try to suss out what the government's role in that income is. But just pointing out, I mean, you'd agree that those are certainly that's a limitation of the data set. Nothing. Every data set has limitations. The other aspect that's interesting is that you noted.
Let me just interject because you're right that I can't see is that somehow, well, we have to do more indirect things to figure out if that's ultimately from the government or not, and we'll get to that.
Right.
But I do think that it's appropriate to include that in the first part of the paper, which is tracing out what is the life cycle pattern. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in that beyond just the mean income, which I hope we'll get to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so
but all that stuff should conceptually be included. That is part of the
except for inheritance. And again, physicians, a large percent of physicians have come from wealthy backgrounds. It's one of the knock on, how much of a meritocracy our society is. It's not unreasonable to think that a significant portion of physicians have income that's coming from inheritance, et cetera. That is beyond just what their medical practice is. But the other thing you notice is that, one of the kind of the lines that was tweeted out by the poor young man that was what's the word being engaged with on Twitter was that physicians on average earn $344,000 per year, right? That's a pretty impressive number, which it is. It's an impressive number, but of course it's physicians that are on average 50 years old earn $344,000 per year. So one of the aspects of of this paper is that what you're looking at, right, is a large data set of these of this this age range from 20s to whatever, to 70 something, right? And what you're capturing is not necessarily what the prospects for physicians earning is right now. So for a 30-year-old physician right now who's in his second year out from practice, what are his prospects of earning going forward, right? That's something we are fairly acutely feeling in the trenches, if you will. What you're capturing is the last 20 years per se, right? So the average person who's 50 years old in 2020, right, is making $344,000 per year. Now, and again, it's relatively obvious to most of us physicians who are kind of out there now, who are earning and doing whatever, that the ground beneath us is shifting quite rapidly. So a 50-year-old physician right now, we, as relatively young, not Michelle. Michelle is, a senior citizen.
I'm right.
physician. But
I practice in the golden age.
For most, so for folks, for 50-year-olds, they practiced, certainly for 60-year-olds, certainly 70-year-olds, my goodness, they practice in this relative, what we consider as the golden age of medicine, where, an echocardiogram being done in the office generated $400 worth of income, where the vast majority of physicians were in private practice, which meant that the pass-through in terms of what was generated in terms of gross and what went through to physicians is way higher than what somebody who's coming out at the age of 32 as a second year, third year, attending is making, and what his prospects are moving forward. So, I'll tell you that, in the 1980s, a 30-some-year-old physician coming out, the path was they were going to become a partner, and as partner, they were going to make, depending on what subspecialty or whatever they were going to make a portion of that income. And I can tell you that right now, certainly that's not at all how it is. Now that the debt from medical school has also, of course, gone up. But part of the issue with this data set is that it's it's looking back and saying, okay, a 50-year-old is earning $344,000 per year. But that is almost definitely, I'm telling you, the vast majority of 50-year-old physicians right now, they're folks that have some brush with private practice, right? So if you have some brush with private practice in the past, if you were a partner, if you had some type of partnership track, you were bought out, etc., you don't sell your practice to hospitals for nothing. You sell your practice for something, correct? And you get that, you invest that, your income becomes whatever. When you sell to a hospital, you are able to negotiate, because you have this large practice, you're able to negotiate $1 per RVU at a certain amount, which allows you to replace income, to be somewhat similar to what your income in private practice was before. So those are some of the little nuances in terms of when I'm looking at your paper to suggest that, hey, this is certainly reasonable and good, and I believe certainly that 50-year-olds may be making this. Do I think that a 30-year-old physician now is going to be in that same position when they're 50? I'm not quite. I don't quite. I would have trouble believing that, given the trajectory of where we are now. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. I mean, at some level, you're just saying we can't predict the future, and that's
well, no, I can't.
Right. I mean, you can. I'm sorry.
Meaning, I'm saying we have seen the trajectory in terms of, we know, for instance, that 70% of folks were in private practice before. We know that 30% of folks are in private practice now. We know that folks that are in private practice versus employed, there's a much different rate in terms of rate of growth of salary, et cetera. So, So
yes, I can't see the future. I mean, I can see the present, and I think you would even admit that what you're saying is really the present versus the past, to the past versus the future. But maybe you have really impressive power.
Right. I mean, if things reverse and we're able to, go into private practice again and be able to capture more, but yes.
But so more substantively, I think it's actually a fascinating question,
right?
Which we don't study in this paper, but probably should in another, of what all of this actually means on net, because you've got a couple of different phenomena happening here, which could be important, and it's not clear which way they all go. So one is practices getting bigger and getting acquired, and your intuition on that is, well, we all used to be the head honcho and capture, all this value from the practice, and now we're just cogs in the machine or something, if I can put words in your mouth,
right?
And underpaid cogs in a profitable machine, is I think is the implication there. And so there's that force, but at the same time, and this is something that a lot of people have expressed a lot of concern about, that consolidating into large practices creates a lot of value for that practice by the ability to get higher prices from insurers.
Right.
And we don't say anything about how much of that accrues to the individual physicians.
Right.
So if the rates go up, I don't know who gets that. Someone's getting it. I don't know who.
I can guarantee you, I can't guarantee anything, but I'm pretty sure that what seems to be happening is that hospitals pay a premium to senior partners to get patients to kind of, you know, build that kind of patient base that generates downstream revenue. The new partners, the new employees, they're not partners anymore. The employees that are hired. I mean, again, it used to be that when somebody's coming out and graduating, certainly and it still exists in certain portions of the country. A lot of rural areas still are dominated by private practice, et cetera. But certainly the large metro areas where hospitals are dominant and have a lot of market share, what happens is that you don't have a really option. So your option as coming out is to join these practices at the pay rate that they select. And so you really have no leverage coming out. So the leverage was enjoyed by the senior partners, the hospitals, systems, et cetera, kind of, you know, view that as kind of a down payment on building up this group of patients. And then it's become harder and harder certainly for younger people. I mean, there's almost no one that is relatively young and just hanging out a shingle and trying to compete with the health system that's down the road, because if you're a specialist, they've bought all the primary care doctors. Who's going to refer you patients? They don't allow anyone to refer anyone. So that's an interesting part of it. But it certainly seems to me, sitting on the ground, that it's unlikely that physicians are capturing, certainly the physicians that are 30 now, which are, by the way, a lot of the folks that are engaging with Dr. Abuluk and you know, on some of these tweets. Those are, a lot of them are in that age group and saying, wait, this doesn't make sense. This is not our reality, really, whether it be the median salaries or not. But that's a good point. The other thing, the other interesting thing. So then, you know, the next thing to talk about, the next thing to try to figure out, which is even harder to do, is figuring out how the government, how government policy changes, how much the government is funding these, you know, incomes of physicians, right? And so tell us a little bit about how you did that.
So as economists tend to, we think on the margin. So we don't say, well, we're going to ask as a share of all of your income, how much comes from the government in some sense. We say when the government makes a modest change, a meaningful but a modest change to a payment rate, how much of that extra do you get? And so we're saying at the margin, if the government pays a little bit more or a little bit less, how will that affect the physician who's getting that or who has the potential to get that? And here what we find is very much in line with your intuition. People who look in the tax data like they are practice owners, like they're self-employed, they get a good chunk of it. And people who are in larger practices don't get much at the margin, and maybe something, but a much smaller share compared with those who are running the show or who are in a very. And the other interesting thing is we look at those who are in a very concentrated practice by specialty, as opposed to so you can think of a small firm that has multiple specialties versus a small practice that's really focused in one specialty. In the latter, they're all exposed to the same sort of change, and in the more diversified one, then only some are exposed and others are not. And so it goes exactly like you'd expect. Those who are all exposed, there's sort of no way to share risk. So when the government pays more or pays less, it passes through to all of you. In the multi-specialty or larger practices, then it seems to be spread out a little bit. So you don't get every lesson, you share it with other people.
What about the ACA? You guys used that as your quasi-experimental model, so where you looked at a change in policy in terms of Medicaid reimbursement that came about because of the ACA, which basically tried to increase the payments paid for Medicaid patients, because that's been a long-standing bone of contention, is that Medicaid payments are too low. And so one of the ACA things was to increase payments for a certain thing to make them higher relative to Medicare.
The other
right.
long-standing bone of contention is that primary care
Right.
is underpaid. Now, you're
Right.
both cardiologists, is that right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, so I won't ask your opinion on whether primary care is underpaid or overpaid. I know cardiologists provide a lot of primary care in effect. But that is a longstanding
Right.
bone of contention. And so what the ACA did was it increased primary care rates to Medicare levels for a couple of years, funded by the federal government. And
Right,
so
so
that's the shock we look at. Yeah.
Right. So so can you explain a little bit about that shock and how you look to correlate that change in policy? How the heck did you figure out what that change in policy did to, what the physicians' wallets getting fatter, how much they were getting fatter?
Sure. Well, it's very simple, right?
Okay.
Primary care was the beneficiary. And so, that's the group for whom the Medicaid rates increased. And so we just effectively just compare the trajectory of primary care income with a control group. And for that control group, we take people who we know are not exactly comparable, but as we think as close as we can to primary care, and that is internal medicine subspecialties, for example, cardiology. The logic there is to a large extent, they're relatively similar production technologies. It's largely about office visits as opposed to procedures. And I know it's not perfect, and we have to split people up somehow and predict, are they going to be, which side of this are they going to be on, the treatment group or the control group? But basically that's what we do, and it's not perfect, but I think it's pretty good. And so we look for people in the same state. What is the divergence in your incomes from the period before this policy took effect and until the policy took effect? And so we see a 5% relative growth for primary care when the fee bump took effect, and that implies that about half of the fee bump passed through into primary care physicians' income.
Huh. So is there, I mean, are there any error estimates to this? Is there a range of,
Yes.
Is there a range that you can get? Meaning 4 to 5%. Look, I'm just saying this because one of my awakenings to the ACA, me coming out as being very anti the ACA after being a big time proponent under, when it was being proposed, was partly because I was gung-ho about being paid for value, thinking that, hey, high value, we do the right things, we practice by guidelines, and, what the heck, fine, implement whatever program you want, will benefit. And then it just turned into this morass of laws and meaningful use. And, suddenly you were getting paid a bonus for EMRs. And then after X number of years, you were getting penalized if you didn't do X, Y, and Z. And you had to print out pieces of paper, give it to the patient, and most of them ended up in the garbage as they were leaving out the door. These clinical summaries. Anyway, it's a long story, but my point being that it ended up, and this is not just me, but a wide experience of certainly private practice folks who had to try to implement the ACA. This is opaque to the employed guys, because the employed guys had some performance initiative improvement people who were taking care of some of the details, and they had MAs and other extenders running around trying to do this. If it was me responsible for trying to make sure all this stuff happened, it's what the heck, this is requiring a fair amount of effort to do, and it's not necessarily related to quality. So the vast majority of folks like me that went through some of that stuff, I'd be hard pressed to see that there was a bump in income because of the ACA. So what actually happened on the ground for a lot of folks is that they either said, screw this, I'm staying in my paper chart, or they sold their practice, or they just retired. And that's part of why, that significant acceleration of jettisoning of independent practice kind of, and then kind of the dinosaurs. Now the solo practitioners are kind of dinosaurs. It's who the heck does that anymore? So, I didn't really, that certainly is not, it doesn't feel like this vast number of PCPs. The ACA was implemented, you did this Medicaid thing, and suddenly you had incomes that were going up for PCPs across the board. That's like not at all the experience of primary care physicians across. It could be the experience of large health systems that were able to leverage something to increase something and then pass that down via some type of salary thing. But certainly that's not the experience of the vast majority of independent physicians with the ACA.
Well, so that's why we have a control group, right? I'm not evaluating here, was the ACA good or bad,
right,
or even was the ACA good or bad for physicians' incomes?
Right.
There's too much going on, including all the stuff you say and more.
Right.
We narrow in on this particular policy, and the goal, the hope, the assumption is that we're able to control for the other things that are changing due to the ACA over this time period. Yeah. But your intuition here actually it's exactly opposite what your intuition said, because you said a moment ago that you would expect that maybe you'd get it if you're in a big system, right? But it's actually exactly the opposite. Is that right? If you're in a big system, then when the rates go up for particular services for Medicaid patients, you don't go rewrite your contract. You don't go get a new contract with a new salary or apparently not even a new bonus just because Medicaid is now paying Medicare rates. It's only, I shouldn't say only, but it's really more so if you run the show yourself.
So I think there may be some successful people that may have been able to increase their payments, and I do know some of those people that were able to increase their payments with the ACA by successfully implementing workflows. But maybe it doesn't take into account people that went out of business or people that gave up. The conclusion, what you say in your paper. Okay.
Let me just correct that. So
sure.
So we don't drop you if you go out of business.
Okay.
Or, as long as you're still alive and reporting a tax return, we'll see you.
I see. But again, if you went out of practice and your income either goes up slightly, how do you know that's not because your 401k income did better or whatnot? You don't.
So we.
I mean, how does that make sense? If you go out of business and your income goes up year to year, that's not from the practice.
So we first of all,
that has nothing to do with the ACA, of course. Then
of course. That's just not the pattern in the data, right? As people work less, as people retire, their incomes go down. So there's just no way that would drive this result.
Okay. So, but you're saying primary care physicians are 1.7 percentage points more likely, or 12% of baseline, to be in the top 1% of income earners after the increase in reimbursements. So they're 1.7 percentage points more likely. How robust do you think that number is?
I don't remember the confidence interval of that particular number off the top of my head. I can tell you for the main result on this fee bump, the 5% or so, the confidence interval on that 5% increase in income, you asked for it. I wasn't going to go start talking about standard errors. We can talk about how we cluster our standard errors and other statistical minutiae if you want, but you asked for it. So 5% increase in primary care, and the range on that is from 4% to 5.8 or 5.9, looking at this graph. So that's the amount of statistical precision that we have on that.
Okay, but you use that to say that there's a 12%.
We have a separate regression, which I don't have in front of me and don't remember the standard error on, which generates this 1.7 percentage point number. So for that, we change our outcome variable. In the previous one, our outcome variable is just the income itself.
Okay.
The one that gives you the 5%. We do a separate analysis where the outcome variable is an indicator for whether you're above a certain income threshold.
I see.
Which is this top 1% threshold.
Okay.
And in that one, we get the 1.7 percentage point effect.
I understand. So, it kind of flies against what certainly a lot of physicians believe of what the ACA did and what its impact was on earnings, especially for primary care physicians. But
Well,
that is what it is.
I don't want you to think about this as the ACA. I want you to think about this as
No, I understand.
a targeted reimbursement increase.
I know, but but we have to evaluate the surrogate, right? You're using this. I mean, you're using a surrogate to decide. You're using a certain shock, right? You're using
the shock is not the ACA. The shock is
that change in policy. Sorry, that change in policy for that one specific thing. Right. So I guess it's possible.
And so if you wanted to say what is the effect of the ACA as a whole, I think you'd need a different strategy.
I understand what you're saying. I understand. Okay. But again, the idea that a Medicaid policy change resulted in, I mean, again, I'm just telling you from a physician standpoint who's sitting there, who knows what Medicaid pays, et cetera, right? The best thing that a business decision that private practice physicians can make is to stop taking Medicaid. So the idea that there's a Medicaid change that results in some significant impact on physician income, and then to use that to then say, okay, this is what the government impact is, and it's pretty significant. It's a lot of physicians would look at that with somewhat of a slanted eye. But I understand what you're saying. It's one little policy to see how that may change income. I get it. But so the other thing I want to. Do you have anything else to say specifically about that? I think I covered that, right?
You're asking me or Michelle?
No, you. But so the other interesting thing is that the last thing before we turn over to Michelle is you looked at, again, very comprehensive paper, so I give you guys props. How do physician earnings compare to outside options? And so you specifically looked at lawyers and you compared it to lawyers, correct? And one of the things you noted was the idea of a discount rate. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Sure. Discount rate means that you'd prefer to have money now rather than have money later, right? If I give you $100 now, you can go invest it. You can use it to expand your practice or just go into the stock market or the bond market. And then use that capital to do something over the coming years. And then when you want to spend it, there's more because you've done something productive with that. And so having money now is more valuable than having money later. And this is
so how do you pick that discount rate? Because this gets to the point of this and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm a cardiologist, not an economist, some of this elasticity of supply, right? Because whenever you talk about incomes and reducing incomes or something, you always want to think about, supply of the labor market, right? Mm-hmm. And the question is how elastic or inelastic it is to that change. And basically what you're getting at with this section is that, well, we have to consider what other options doctors may have in society as it exists before mm-hmm. we kind of talk about these things. So again, the effort was to be empiric. And so you came up with discount rates. How do you come up with those discount rates? You use 3% and 5%, for instance.
Yeah. So this part, I don't have a deep scientific answer to. Those are that's the range of numbers that's pretty common in the literature. They're consistent with interest rates, more or less during this period. We thought about doing exercise to come up with a better number, more data-driven number. But basically what we do is a couple different numbers and show that the pattern isn't really that different. Okay. Right? When you don't know the perfect number, then you sort of try a few and you see if your results are super sensitive, and they could be, right? You could imagine that it makes a huge difference precisely because physicians' earnings are so delayed, right? Length of training to become a physician, and especially a highly specialized right. physician, is very, very long.
Right. So
discounting lowers the value of all of that, but it doesn't change the relative comparisons that much.
Right, but I guess if you use a discount rate of 20%, for instance, that's much different than using a discount rate of 3% or 5%, correct? And that would give you, that would
20% would change things.
Right.
20% would be rejected by the data. If you think the right discount rate is 20%,
right,
then you're saying that if I give you $1,000 today, you'll give me $1,200 next year.
Okay.
And that's not the case in any market with as little risk as this one. That, if you want to lend money to a firm that's on the verge of failing, then maybe you're talking about a 20% payout next year. But this is the other thing that we find in this exercise. Physicians are virtually guaranteed to earn well and earn enough that they'll be able to pay back any loans. So 20% discount rate would just be resoundingly rejected by the data.
I see. When you make the comparison, maybe the better question is, when you make the comparison between physicians and lawyers, how do you account for? Do you need? I guess do you need to account for the fact that the professions are so incredibly different? For instance, emergency medicine, right? You frequently will work night shifts. If you're a working mother, you're spending, three dinner. What is the value of 3 dinners a week away from your family? How do you even, so because you do make some comparisons about doctors, lawyers, and the fact that, hey, it's, just for 1 year less of education or something like that, the differential in terms of earnings is pretty massive. So I guess that's what I was getting to with the discount rate. But how do you approach that? Meaning,
sure,
there's a lot of things when you choose medicine that a lot of physicians would say, especially physicians that are the higher paying specialties, like neurosurgeons, right? Like if you're a neurosurgeon that's on call, it's very different than being a primary care physician on call, right? A primary care physician is on call, who gets called with somebody having chest pain at 8 p.m. says, go to the ER. Who's in the ER? The emergency medicine physician, who then has to call, who then, if it's an actual heart attack that's going to take this person's life in 90 minutes, has to activate the cath lab. The cath lab then calls an interventional cardiologist. That interventional cardiologist has to come in, it has to be on call and be able to come in within 60 minutes, open an artery, take the liability of that because sometimes things go wrong. And then once there's a bleed because you've given them all these blood thinners in their brain, now they call it neurosurgeon, and now a neurosurgeon has to come in. I mean, there's a massive system of folks that are literally right now, as you speak, right? Like, you are within 60 minutes of having some highly specialized surgeon kind of open up an artery in your brain or in your heart. And that's an expensive, that's an expensive proposition in the richest country in the world. So how does one, really is it even worth trying to quantify those things? So
we do our best to let the data tell us the story there. So first, so you said a lot of things here. So first, let me just briefly mention the lawyers. And so here, if you look at our life cycle graphs, you'll see that we do observe that at the beginning of the careers, lawyers are earning more, right? They're not on average, or really any of them probably, I shouldn't say any, but lawyers are not training for as long as physicians, right? And so their earnings go faster. And so that the discounting is intended to account for precisely that, right? We then account for hours worked, and we do our best to let the data tell us what the return is to hours worked. So we look at the relationship between earnings and a couple of measures of what you've talked about. So the length of training is one, and the other thing that we've been able to link in the Census Bureau data infrastructure is survey responses, where people of different specialties report how many hours they work. And so we look at the relationships and we say, look, yes, if you're looking at the graphs, there's a really striking relationship that those with more training earn more, and those who report working more hours also earn more. And that's how we account for it. We don't say that, we think cardiac surgeons or interventional cardiologists are overpaid for this. We say, look, they report working this many hours, and the data show that on average, these extra work hours are associated with a very substantial premium. And we're not going around saying that that's wrong or excessive or anything. We're saying that's the relationship in the data.
Yeah, there's a lot of different. For instance, physicians work 10 to 12 hours more than lawyers.
Well, that's not an assumption. That's
well, it's based on survey data. I mean, yeah, as good as the survey data is.
The data aren't perfect for sure,
Yeah.
but you know, I don't see any reason that lawyers would systematically overestimate or physicians would systematically underestimate this.
I don't know. Yeah, but I mean, anyway, that's a little bit of it. Well, it's not completely pick a union because obviously you're making some big assumptions on that. But any neurosurgeon that's on call every fortnight, right? When you're on call, you're on call. Meaning you're, on. I mean, there's no lawyer that's on call every fortnight. How do you get only a 10 to 12 hour difference? Because just by being on call, you're adding, 5 p.m. to 9 a.m. the next day. That's a whole 14 hours extra every fortnight that you're working. And then on the weekends, you're on call the entire weekend. So you're working from 6 a.m. Actually Friday night at 6 p.m. to Monday morning at 7 a.m. I don't understand how. I mean, that's what a neurosurgeon does. So a neurosurgeon is on call, waiting to go and crack open someone's head that entire time. So how do you? Anyway,
so let me be clear about what's an assumption and what's data. And look, the data could have flaws, for sure. I don't know how neurosurgeons are responding when they're asked about these hours. The mean that we see for neurosurgeons is 63.4 hours. That's a pretty hefty number of hours worked per week. I don't know how they're counting all these call shifts, but it doesn't seem obvious that they're omitting them from based on that number. The data don't distinguish between hours on call versus hours in the office versus hours in the operating theater. We don't see that level of granularity, unfortunately. So we're just trusting people to report in hopefully an unbiased way, or a way in which the noise is not different between the different specialties and between the different occupations. And we also use the data to see that neurosurgeons have very long training periods. And so I'm not saying that what the right return to that should be. Right. We're saying this is, it seems to have a very hefty return. Maybe it's appropriate. I'm not saying it's not.
Right. Yeah, no, it gets to that. I think, again, these are means you talk about in terms of 60 hours. I don't know. Yeah. And you're including, there's 70-year-old partners. This is the granularity that is really important, though, because I'm telling you.
Well, we're including 70.
No, I know, but so a 70-year-old neurosurgeon who's doing, who's now not doing overnight call, right? He's maybe working 40 hours. You may have a 30-year-old, 35-year-old neurosurgeon that's working 80 some hours, right? So anyhow,
so the income is an average, and the hours are an average. So we're treating them comparably.
Right. So you can. So my point is that the 35-year-old guy who's working those 80 hours a week, that looks at 60 hours and is like, "What the heck are you talking about?" 60 hours is like, I haven't worked 60 hours of my week since I was a paper boy. When they're looking at what they are going to earn, they're looking at what they're making now, and they're looking at what they want to make, certainly down the line.
And the other thing that we account for is, and we show the graph for neurosurgeons, which is the most striking. The peak earnings are, I don't want to characterize high or low, but I mean, $1 million a year is certainly is I'll let you characterize it for whatever you think it's worth. I'm not saying too high. Or be clear, I never said too high. I never even said high. I guess now I've said it in the process of denying it. But it is what it is. It's 4 times family practice approximately. But it's only for a short number of years, at least on average, right? The training and the increase to get there is very long, and then it declines. So we're accounting for all of that and discounting, I think appropriately, the fact that it only comes after a long period of investment.
All right, so we're going to get to Michelle, and Michelle has a different tack. But one of the questions I want to not forget and have you answer is, who should determine? Michelle, remind us, who should determine what the value of a physician or value of, say, a neurosurgeon is. But Michelle,
Yeah,
go ahead.
let's leave that maybe
to the end. Yeah.
To later. Josh, I want to come back. I'm going to shift sort of. I don't get into the number crunching the way Anish does. I mean, I'm really always impressed by how deep he gets into the weeds of these numbers. But I want to go. You were sort of alluding that on a couple of occasions that you're primarily descriptive. It's just like you're telling us how the stars are moving. How the planets are moving around the heavens here. How would you describe, for people who haven't read the paper, who are listening, what's your punchline, or if you will, I mean, your 2-sentence summary of your findings? Because I don't think we really have articulated that precisely. Can you tell us?
Sure. So physicians are really near the top of the income distribution. The government can move these incomes around quite a lot. But a lot of that return, a lot of the reason that physicians' earnings are what they are, seems to reflect pretty standard labor market forces. So that latter part gets to this part that we were just talking about with Anish, that there is a return to hours worked, and there is a return to long investments. And so the labor market is there in the background, and that means the government couldn't really run around and say, oh, we want to make drastic changes to this, right? If the government were to say, we're going to cut all physicians' incomes to lawyers' levels, that would really change the market and would probably lead to a reduce the number of people willing to do those
things like that.
48-hour calls.
Right. So now that's is that I mean, again, I'm stepping away from the numbers and I'm just going a little bit towards what Anish was mentioning earlier. Is that a surprise for economists? I mean, is this? You mentioned that you want to put the number, be very specific in terms of the numbers. And my follow-up question is that if you're trying to be very specific to the numbers, is it that once you have the numbers, then economists pass on the research over to the policy guys, and then the policy guys decide with the numbers how to address the policies?
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. Whether the policy guys actually listen to the economists is a different question. But
shouldn't the economist say? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Our hope is that people can make informed decisions. Right? We think that it's silly to have discussions about the top 1% without knowing who they are and what they earn and what the consequences of changing those numbers would be. And it's kind of silly for policymakers to argue about whether physicians earn too much or too little without having accurate numbers about what they earn and who is earning this much or that much. And so
I wonder about that.
We're not saying what they should be. Yeah.
Right. I mean, how would it, how would it determine if it's too much or too little, regardless of what the numbers are? Because you could have numbers that are 3 times as high or 5 times lower, and you still wouldn't know on the basis of the numbers whether they're too high or too low. Right? I mean, aren't there other economic principles that are at play to decide if there's a good allocation of a just allocation of physicians and a just distribution of income and so forth? I mean, aren't there, besides just the pure what the numbers are type considerations?
Look, you could find people who would come on here and give a compelling answer to that. I am not.
I'm going to give you my answer.
I don't know what the right word is. I am not confident enough that I have all the answers to how the world ought to operate, that I would personally be comfortable saying what is just or not just. The way I would think about it is, if I had all the data in the world, and we're excited about these data, but they are still far from everything you would need to know to figure out what is the value that we're getting for that. So the ideal study, let me just say what the ideal study would
sure,
be.
Go ahead. All right.
That from my perspective, and then you can disagree and tell me you do it differently. But the ideal study for me would allow me to do something, look at something like the Medicaid fee bump or something like that, and say, this is how much it changed incomes. And because of that change in incomes, we had more or fewer people willing to practice primary care, and they were better or worse at their job and saving more or fewer lives, and how much. And so if we had all of that wrapped together, then we could start to say that the government should pay more or should pay less because it's getting value in the form of improved health, improved quality of physicians or not. So that's what I would want to know. And this is a first step in that. Not a first, n plus one step in that, but there are many more steps to go.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that would actually accomplish what you're saying, because I mean, first of all, as we mentioned, I mean, these arbitrary sort of value equality measures are sort of very questionable. Number two, even if you decide there's less mortality or life saved, from this, I mean, you really have to look at the global thing. I mean, right? I mean, because you're making an intervention, you pick a few outcomes, you make a change that you think is a positive outcome, but you have no idea about what are the ramifications. I mean, the whole economy is connected. I mean, it's connected entirely. So it's still conceivable that, there could be good outcomes or bad outcomes that you can't account for just because you're making changes like that. So I'm skeptical that really on the basis of empirical research, we can move towards, what we should all be aiming for, economists, policy people, doctors, whatnot, a better society in general. I think we should be ambitious from that standpoint, try to be morally ambitious. So actually, I'm going to take the other tack. Yeah, go ahead.
What do you do in your medical practice? Do you say, here's some evidence on an intervention for a patient with really severe renal failure, and they also have class 3 heart failure, but we don't know if this intervention might also have impacts on their liver, and so we're not going to do it until we have every possible study. No, you say, look,
right.
We have the evidence, the best available evidence, we'll read it, and then we'll make a decision that's as informed as we can, using a combination of the evidence and our understanding of the broader mechanisms, which might raise some red flags. Wait, we think.
Right. No,
but you don't say we're not going to do anything because we don't have all the evidence.
No, correct. But let me actually engage you on the broader mechanisms, because it seems to me that it's obvious that physicians are making way too much, way more money because of government intervention and subsidies and all the goodies that government has spent into, has all the resources and the energies and the positive policies by which government has subsidized healthcare in various different ways over decades and decades and decades.
Michel says this because he earns less than the 50% of cardiologists.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, shouldn't economists say, listen, if governments are going to, and that you're at the University of Chicago, so an illustrious, and I'm not necessarily a fan, but Milton Friedman pointed out the fact that if you have licensing laws, you have a cartel, right? And then you're going to raise, and you look at the data, and it's clearly what happened. Licensing laws passed in the 1910s, and then in the 1920s, you had a medical inflation that became rampant. If you have policies that promote health insurance, right? You're going to have moral hazard. I mean, it's not, Kenneth Arrow made it sound like it was something to be determined empirically, whether there was moral hazard or not. I mean, it took 50 years to have some empirical data. And now the econometricians are saying, oh yes, after all, there is moral hazard when you introduce insurance. And so, I mean, shouldn't the economists say, listen, if you're going to introduce Medicare in the 1960s, And then you see that it's after Medicare is introduced in the 1960s, and Medicare is going to pay doctors, their usual and customary fees, right? That's how it was for about 20 years. Then you have doctors driving Lamborghinis and having 4-day weeks and playing golf on Wednesdays and all that stuff. Why do we need to further quantify the fact that if you subsidize something, you get people who get, in all likelihood, on the aggregate, not individually, but on the aggregate, more than they deserve, more, right?
Well, so let me tell you the opposite story, which
okay,
a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, will be thinking right now as they are slamming their desks or their car horns in anger at what you've said. And that is, the government has this big role. By introducing Medicare, it took control of a third of their patients, and the most reliable, most lucrative ones, because Medicare patients are more likely to need care. And then, after promising to pay usual and customary, it said, "Oh, this is too expensive. We're going to start cracking down." And that's exactly, you can also write down that model.
Oh yeah, of course.
Government wants to save
right,
money,
right.
And it's going to squeeze incomes, and that our rates are actually lower than what they should be. We should be making huge amounts because people value their health so much. And there are other University of Chicago economists who have written about this and said, look, as society gets richer, people value their health more because they don't need as many gadgets. And so, what else is left to spend on? Health. And so people spend more on health. And so the doctors should be earning through the moon. And it's only because Medicare is trying to use what economists call its monopsony power. It's leveraged by being a major buyer of healthcare services to drive down the rates and drive down their wages. And so it's too low.
Yeah, but that would be wrong, because it'd be just an opinion. I mean, because at the end
What do
of
you
the
mean
day,
it's wrong? It's right.
What is true? No, I mean,
that is what's happening. I mean, that's just historical fact.
No,
right?
no. I mean, it's right that yes, Medicare is squeezing doctor salary,
Right.
but of course, in response to the squeezing, then you ask Anish, what are you going to do when Medicare cuts your rates? He's going to say, well, I'm going to see twice as many patients. I'm going to have them come back every other day, right? But
I would never do that.
As we talked about before with Anish, you cut enough, you cut to Medicaid rates, and they just say, okay, well, now I'm not going to see anybody, right? I'm just not going to see the patients. And I have other work on that, which we can talk about next time.
Yeah. So hold on. But you guys are saying the same thing. So Michelle and I mean, I think most folks would agree that the government subsidy that has existed since Medicare came on scene actually has been very good. And so the golden age, the reason I think you have these 50-year-olds making what they're making, and 30-year-olds that are looking at the prospects of what they're making, given what the larger forces in healthcare are and what reimbursements are doing, just for everything, like in terms of cutting stuff. I think that's why you're seeing folks having kind of the discomfort that they're having. But you guys are agreeing, right? You guys are agreeing with the fact that large subsidies that have been provided by the government has been exploited by a fair number of a reasonable chunk of the physician populace to be very, very good. And as we've had
right. I mean, exploded it has a connotation of sort of intent, it's just I mean, not so much exploded, but it's just it's a natural consequence.
It's increased,
right?
Yeah.
It's going to go up.
Yeah.
But my point is that and another question is, I mean, shouldn't economists do healthcare economists? Do you consider yourself a healthcare economist, Josh?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I consider myself an economist who works on healthcare, but
okay,
yes,
right. But
you can abbreviate it the way you said. That's fine.
I mean, do budgets and deficits? I mean, at the federal level, do those ever matter, or do you leave that to the policy people? You say, isn't that something that healthcare economists should also advise the policy people on, and say, listen, your budgets are going to, it's unsustainable. It's unsustainable.
We leave it to the macroeconomists.
I see.
Well, but I think we'd all be agreed on the fact that, I mean, again, Josh, you're actually hedging more than we are. But I think one of my comments with the inferno that your paper created was that the best thing that we can do as physicians in terms of dealing with economists and what economists think about what physicians make and whatnot is to wean ourselves as much as possible from this third party government payment. So do you think that's going to be a reasonable approach? I think a lot of folks, at least folks like me, are worried that in whatever is to come down the line, you're going to get a system like Canada, like the NHS, which really limits, which has basically government single payer, which can really controls prices. That's the best way of controlling prices, having that massive monopoly do that. But then they also greatly limit the existence of a private market, right? The NHS does it in a variety of ways. So does a system like Canada. So, the idea would be that, okay, fine, the government wants to do what it wants to do, let them do whatever they want to do, like the VA, fine, somebody wants to go work the VA, they can go work the VA, but kind of, unplug from this kind of government subsidy system, and then you get away from economists trying to figure out, well, how much are you worth and whatnot. You just let the market kind of decide. Is that something that economists, forget economists, is that something you think is a reasonable comeback to this?
It's not unreasonable, but it's also not at all easy. So who is going to pay? You're saying, if you're saying take away all third parties, you're saying, right, well, let's have the patients pay. Right. Just pay directly.
Right. Well,
you can do that. Yeah. But it's not. Mm-hmm. It's not clear that patients.
Yeah. What would happen is what would happen in all other markets, right? I mean, it's not like there's a car insurance market, right? There's a life insurance mm-hmm. market, right? And those existed.
Wait, hold on. I thought you made a stronger statement. I thought you said get rid of all third party.
Yeah. What I mean is, naturally speaking, you would have the market would. Medicare is somewhat of a anomaly in terms of Medicare. There's this idea because of Medicare exists. Every person who gets 65 thinks that every single thing, whether it be a hangnail or whatever, is covered per se, right? That's a little bit of an anomaly. That's not something that's natural that kind of emerges. When you see what happens in, say, car insurance, right? You don't have, oil changes are not covered by some insurance company. So naturally speaking, because of, you would pool risk and you would create some type of catastrophic insurance thing so that if you showed up in a hospital with a bleed in your head, you'd have some type of insurance. But my point is I should be more specific. So I think that would emerge naturally in terms of these other third parties, whether it be for the over 65 market or not.
There was private insurance before Medicare, right?
Right, exactly, and that would happen here again.
Although, Josh, they only came about because of government intervention and some enabling laws that were passed, not only at the federal level but also, in the 1930s at the state level. So the insurance companies had no interest in getting into healthcare. As far as I'm concerned, I disagree with Anish here a little bit because I think health is uninsurable, and it's all due to government intervention. And then once you have health insurance, there's enough of a moral hazard that it starts driving costs up and up, and it's unstoppable. And what would happen is that if you don't have health insurance, prices would fall through. I mean, there'd be no concern about healthcare prices because they would fall to the ground, and it would be, the way you see it for things like, LASIK and, the few things that are a little bit more market competitive, the prices fall immediately. So that would be, and that's, I would hope that's something that economists would say more frequently.
I think the problem is,
as opposed to point out what seems to be obvious, that if you subsidize some things, you get,
it's hard to study because it's so rare. Right, and
you can do it historically. It's not as good, but it's
and because even when and it's also, to be honest, a bit of a case of looking under the lamppost. We have data when we have mm-hmm. these super regulated insurers, right? You talk about LASIK, that's a good example, but if it's not paid by insurance, it's not in our data sets very often.
Which brings up the point that without health insurance, there would be no health economists. Right?
I don't think that's right. We have We have all sorts of other economists studying industries that are not nearly as regulated as healthcare.
Yeah, perhaps.
All right, I want to end with some good news about your paper, right? Because I actually thought your paper was not as inflammatory as some thought it was, though I understand why. I think the one gentleman who was tweeting live seems like a very earnest, good guy. Made this comment about ridiculous neurosurgeon salaries, and I think that kind of was taken badly. And of course, it's in the context that in general, I think physicians in general feel that economists think that physicians make too much money, that automatically kind of raises hackles. But your paper, the reason I didn't find it, I read the paper after all the hubbub about it. You say some things that are not necessarily that inflammatory. So you say, yes, physicians make a significant amount of money. Yes, a lot of physicians are in the top 1%. Again, these are not things that are necessarily, no one's going to deny. But you say, attractive outside options and an elastic labor supply likely constrain government's ability to cut physician earnings in practice. So you're recognizing the fact that we're in the wealthiest country in the world, and you have a group of folks that are choosing this, partly related to the income potential that they have, and so you say that physicians in the lowest paid, especially primary care, earn on par with lawyers, suggesting that there's limited scope for reductions in earnings for nearly half of all physicians. So you're certainly making the point that there are constraints here to what one can do it. So and even you estimate in your paper, although a generous estimate suggests that reductions of around 20 billion or around 0.5% of national health expenditures could be plausible. So so you're saying that you're estimating that the savings that you could get, even assuming we are transparent, blah blah blah, is around $20 billion per year. Again, we spend, I think, something like $3 trillion per year. This is 0.5% of national healthcare spending. That's what you're saying is on the table and is plausible. Now, Uwe Reinhardt, wonderful gentleman, of course, said. He quoted Adam Smith, right, and said that we trust our health to the physician, our fortune, and sometimes our life and reputation, a lawyer and attorney. Such confidence could not safely be reposed in people of very mean or low condition. Their reward must be such, therefore, as may be given them that rank in society which is so important a trust requires. The long time and the great expense which must be laid out in their education, when combined with the circumstance, necessarily enhance still further the price of their labor. And he went on to make the point that said that, look, even if you reduce physician, salaries by the 20 billion or so that you would want to, it would be a tiny little bit on the entire pie, and you would serve to demoralize physicians a significant amount, which has, of course, its own costs. So I don't know that. Would you disagree with that? Any of that characterization?
I think that's a fair characterization. So we do this exercise where we, as we talked about earlier, we look at the relationship between income and work hours, right, among different specialties.
Yeah.
And then what's interesting is if you estimate this relationship just on the physician specialties, and then you add lawyers, they fit right on that same line, right on that regression line. Right? People are choosing people who are choosing whether to be physicians or choosing a physician specialty are choosing among a number of different lucrative options. As you said, we live in a wealthy society. It's a society that also has very high returns to the highest earners, to being in these really highly skilled specialties, being a very skilled, very productive worker.
Right.
And so, you've got these outside options. And of course, no one's saying that physicians are only motivated by money or primarily or anything like that, but it's a factor, right? Empirically, it's a factor. And so, if you take it away, you're going to drive some people into a different specialty or out of medicine.
And it sure sounds like, Adam Smith is checking in, demand and supply at the door, and kind of saying, hey, you know what, I don't want to mess around with, when I have, I mean, he didn't say this explicitly, I'm paraphrasing, if I
I
have
think
a
a paraphrase here might be useful since the book is 250 years
200
old.
years old, yes. So if I have a bleed in my brain and I have somebody who's cutting into my brain with, careless movement can cause God knows what, I really don't want to mess around with this, and we should have a society that, justly compensates folks at a very high level. So, but I thought.
I would disagree with your characterization that this involves throwing demand and supply out the door.
Okay.
This is a factor that influences demand and factors that influence the importance of supply. But his point is that wages will be higher in these high trust occupations because you want the physician to earn a rent, to earn an economic rent, in order to be really careful. Right.
Well, sir, we've taken up way too much of your time. This is such an interesting conversation. So I'm sorry. Usually we go about an hour. This went certainly much longer than that. So it was really a great conversation. I hope people get a lot out of it, and I hope you didn't get too bruised talking to two doctors.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Thank you.